Welcome to all of you who are here for the second lecture in the SDGs and Dharma Traditions lecture series. We're very happy that you could make it despite all the traffic and so on and so forth. And thank you all who have joined in online to participate in this virtual manner. Just to give you a quick, first and foremost, best wishes and Shubh Ram Navami to all of you. As you know, today is Lord Ram's birthday. And it is a symbol. I mean, it is a moment for us to remember the fact that the whole idea of the avatar and the whole idea of effectively rebalancing. And perhaps Dharma traditions, which is what we are talking about here, is really all about rebalancing all the different energies, rebalancing different forces, and bringing things to a more harmonious, even keel, which I think in the current time we find that is quite out of sync and out of kilter. So thank you all for joining in. I'll just quickly have a brief introduction for those of you here for the first time about Dharma Alliance. Dharma Alliance was set up here in Geneva some time ago, and the basic principle being that the word itself comes from the word dhri, which effectively means that which sustains. So for us, it was very clear that, there's these principles which are primarily around harmony, mutual respect, and the interconnectedness of all life. Those principles are something which we want to bring to the international dialogues and processes. And this is how Dharma Alliance came to be here in Geneva. So we are slowly, gradually building it up, and we really appreciate all the encouragement and support we found from all of you. And we hope to build it in association and in sync with all of your ideas and thoughts. So that's sort of the brief introduction to Dharma Alliance. We also would like to acknowledge that now the Dharma Alliance monthly lecture series are being held in partnership with an organization, Swiss Learning Exchange, which is a Swiss entity which works on sustainability. It's based in Fribourg. It also has offices in other parts of the world. And we are very pleased to acknowledge their partnership and their support in this entire process. And finally, I'd like to now hand over to Juan, the co-founder of Dharma Alliance, who will now introduce Dr. Christopher Jain Miller, who will be giving us this lecture this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. And thank you to those who are viewing us online. It's great to be back again. Last month, we had a wonderful kickoff. I thought it was fantastic, the response the first time, and I'm seeing another wonderful response this evening. With that in mind, I want to introduce Dr. Miller, who's coming to us via California, based in Zürich, but he's also involved in a few projects himself, as you can see from the screen, the Arihanta Institute, which is going well, according to what we talked about a little earlier, and more importantly, he's going to talk about something that's obviously in the news, climate change, and more importantly, the Jain response. Christopher, of course, has been involved with Jain studies for practically, 20 years, as you said earlier. And it'd be great to hear your response in terms of your life, your work, and more importantly, how you view it in terms of climate change. All right.
Thank you so much, Juan. Thank you, Prashant. Thank you, Danesh, for connecting me with Dharma Alliance. Thank you, Dharma Alliance. Thank you to the ambassador from India for coming, and thank you all for coming from near and far. I know some of you came from Zurich like I did, and some are local. So it's really wonderful to have the opportunity to speak with you here and this morning there on the West Coast, where I know some of my colleagues and acquaintances are joining us. So welcome to everyone. My name again is Dr. Christopher Jain Miller. As you can see, my middle name is Jain. I can tell you the story about that later if you want. It's a longer story. But I want to just bring it up because I just want to say that I'm here because I care about climate change deeply, and I know you're here because you do as well. And I also care deeply about the Jain tradition and the yoga tradition. I've been specifically really inspired by Jain principles, as Juan mentioned, for the past 20 years of my life, since I took my first undergraduate course in California on Indic traditions, a part of which Jain tradition was introduced to me at the time. I was so inspired that, of course, eventually I became a vegetarian. Now I'm a vegan, all under Jain influence. And the transformative experiences that I see people go through when they engage with these Dharmic traditions in a meaningful way, I think are powerful. And I think they offer us something very important and significant in light of all the things we face in society right now. There's a conversation that needs to be had, or this needs to be part of the conversation of potential solutions to many of the issues that we face as global society. one of those big issues, and we can't talk about them all, is climate change, as you mentioned. And as we're talking about the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, with the IPCC having just kind of closed the book, I think it was last week, saying, this is it, this is our last chance. I think that this question of the UN's climate action SDG is more important than ever. And what I want to present to you tonight is what a Jain response, at least part of what a Jain response might be, right? And you can extend this response to other Dharmic traditions, because at their root, a lot of the ethical principles are the same. And I think a lot of us here know that. But I'll give it specifically from the Jain tradition, because I think the Jain tradition has specific resources that I find compelling in its philosophy, in its culture, and in the lifestyle that it promotes. And it's that I just want to bring into this discussion around the issue of climate change. So the climate change SDG at the UN, number 13, is climate action. It says we need to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts, right? And the key word I want to emphasize there is action, because I think we have so much knowledge about this already. We know what we need to do. The hardest part is acting, and the action has to take place. We know, as we've heard from the IPCC, and we've heard from climate scientists, and we've heard from climate experts, has to happen at all levels of society. It can't just happen at the structural level. It can't just happen at the corporate economic level. It can't just happen at the individual level. The change has to be, as we heard from the IPCC last week, everyone, everywhere, right now, all the time, right? So I think the Jain tradition brings a good spirit to this, especially at the individual level, as we discuss what we can do if we feel powerless or disempowered to do anything about climate change. We do have things immediately in our back pocket that we can do as individuals that will also influence, I believe, at the structural, political, economic, corporate levels as well. And they are, as we'll see. So as the UN Sustainable Development Goal says here, the world must transform its energy, industry, transport, food, agriculture, and forestry systems to ensure that we can limit global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius, maybe even 1.5 degrees Celsius. I think we all know that. Just want to reiterate, this is why we're here. Let me tell you a little bit about the Jain tradition. Some of you may know about it, others may not. I want to just tell you a little bit about it to know, so you know where I'm coming from. This tradition emerges sometime in its, we might say, measurable form, where we have evidence to really look at where it's coming from, around the 6th or 5th century BCE. A contemporary of the Buddha, who you see here, this is the Buddha over here on my left, you're right. A contemporary of the Buddha, Mahavira, who you see right here next to me, was part of a shared renouncer culture. And what this culture emphasized and what it recognized, of course, is that the world is full of suffering, samsara, this world of constant death and rebirth, this reincarnation that we go through because of our desires and because of all of the things that happen to humans in human life, in all forms of life, we suffer, right? It recognized that. And the fundamental thing they're trying to do is alleviate that suffering, to escape it themselves, the suffering of the world, but also on top of that, be able to help others do it and help others and free the world from violence and free the world from suffering. Okay, so this is just a very brief background of where we're coming from historically. And the story, I think, of Mahavira, the 24th out of 24 spiritual teachers in this tradition, is really inspiring to me. And I remember the first time I read this in graduate school thinking, how profound, okay? Mahavira, like the Buddha, most of us know who the Buddha is, right? Is out in the forest and he's meditating. And he's meditating on everything around him, all life around him. And what does he recognize? Well, first of all, he's meditating with his eyes open. He's not meditating with his eyes closed. He's concentrating on everything that's going on around him. And he sees that nothing wants to experience pain. That's his fundamental insight. On his path towards liberation, on his path towards spiritual emancipation, on his path towards omniscience, he sees something so basic, so fundamental, but so profound. Nothing wants to suffer. Everything has the capacity to experience pain. And therefore, the true spiritual life should advocate for ahimsa, or nonviolence, as you see in the second bullet point here. Ahimsa becomes the foundational spiritual practice to alleviate the world from suffering that you cause to the world. And in doing so, you also alleviate yourself from suffering. It's that interconnection that we heard Juan and Prashant mentioning before, the way that the world is bound together, mutually interconnected, that whatever we do to the world comes back and harms us. And we're seeing that with climate change right now, right? So what I want to suggest as I go through this, and I'll show you, is that this Jain way of life that emerges out of this fundamental principle of nonviolence has so much to offer with regard to what we face today as a global society, including climate change. And it gives us really a chance, as I want to emphasize here, to reach our highest human potential. The different Dharma traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and so forth, identify that highest human potential in different ways, okay? But somehow it is around this idea of liberation, of being liberated from suffering and liberating the world from suffering. The Jain tradition approaches this pretty much across the board through what are known as the 3 jewels of the Jain tradition. These are correct worldview, correct knowledge, and correct conduct. What I'm going to do for you is go through each of these, the way that a Jain response would be to climate change through the prism of these 3 jewels. And jewels, of course, create nice prisms when you look through them, right? They reflect so many things. And I think that the Jain perspective on this issue through these 3 jewels, which are the foundation of the Jain tradition, really bring out a very effective response, or inspire a very effective response, a very holistic approach to things like climate change. But then you could take the method that I'm going to give you right now, you could apply it to almost any issue, right? Whether it's an environmental issue, a social justice issue, you name it, okay? So I'm going to go through each of these and explain what each of these means through the prism of climate change, through the prism of the Jain tradition. So correct worldview. The correct worldview in the Jain tradition is to recognize fundamentally that what we do to society, what we do to other living beings, comes back in some sort of karmic way to affect us. And we're seeing that with climate change right now, right? It's also a worldview that is not delusional. It accepts and sees things as they actually are, right? So from the climate perspective, a correct worldview, and a non-delusional worldview, to make sure we're all on the same page, would first of all to acknowledge that climate change is real, right? There are people who still deny that climate change is real. The correct worldview, according to science, is that it's real. It's also anthropogenic, right? I'm just getting us on the same page here. We're experiencing the effects of the actions of previous and current generations right now, right? It's like karma. It's coming back to hurt us. It's coming back to the things that have happened in the past are coming back to hurt us. And we have, of course, an extremely limited window within which to act that I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. As The Guardian mentioned in 2021, the case is closed, right? 99.9% of scientists agree that the climate emergency has been caused by humans. And they're citing the Environmental Research Letters study in 2021 that made it clear that we did this, right? Or the generations before us built up the system that we're living in now that has caused the current climate situation that we're in. So from a Jain perspective, this is accepting the world as it is and accepting that consequences result from our actions and the things that we do to the environment, including the climate. Now, let me move to correct knowledge, the second of the 3 jewels within the Jain tradition. And this is, again, correct knowledge. When one studies Jain scripture, and if you read this in texts like the Tattvartha Sutra, one of the canonical texts of the Jain tradition, one can have a transformation where they realize what I just told you about correct worldview, that what we do goes around, comes around, right? That what we do to the world comes back and affects us. One can also accumulate this correct knowledge through studying Jain scripture. And there are multiple kinds of correct knowledge. And this is what I want to emphasize here. Multiple kinds of correct knowledge. At the base level, the kind of knowledge that is accepted as real in the Jain tradition is empirical knowledge. Knowledge, of course, that comes through our senses, through our 5 senses. Empirical knowledge is things that we are able to witness with our own bodies, right? Through our eyes, through our skin, through all of our 5 senses. This empirical knowledge, however, is one form of knowledge. There are other, we can say there are 5 basic forms of knowledge. And eventually the idea is to become omniscient, right? Well, I'm guessing none of us are going to become omniscient, right? And according to Jain scriptures, it's not going to happen anytime soon. It has happened, right? Mahavira, other spiritual teachers in the Jain tradition, both men and women, have come to this experience of omniscience, where you know all, right? So it's not going to happen to any of us. So we have from a Jain perspective, the tool in our toolkit to work with right now to come to a correct worldview. The correct knowledge would be empirical knowledge. Okay, another form of knowledge, for example, is scriptural knowledge from the Jain tradition. But what I really want to focus on is empirical knowledge. What does empirical knowledge tell us about climate change? There's a lot of things it tells us about it, right? Empirical science shows us that this is the biggest threat we've ever faced as a human society. But what I really want to focus on now, I think we already know that, is that empirical science also shows us how much is avoidable when we do certain things. Okay, so I want to start with the issue from a kind of database perspective before I even talk about a Jain response to what this might be. Because if we can identify the climate harms that we all routinely commit, we can make a change that has a profound impact when it spreads and becomes more and more practiced and widespread. So let me start with the issues from just a basic scientific perspective. And I'm going to talk about three things: how we eat, how we travel, and how we work, right? I think we know that these are probably things that contribute to climate change. But the reason I'm emphasizing these three and not other things like energy, for example, which is also important, is that these are three things that I think we all have the capacity to really change immediately and walk away with a commitment to do that. So let me start with food habits and climate change, okay? I'm drawing this data here from Our World in Data, publicly available science on a lot of things with regard to climate change. So I really love this website because you can go in and you can tweak, you can put in the foods you eat, you can see what the climate impact is. But what you'll see very quickly when you go to the greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of food product is what I've tried to point out here by adding in a couple things. You see that blue line, everything under that blue line in the middle is plants, right? The carbon emissions, or the total carbon load, this includes methane, but it's built as a carbon model. The total emissions when you eat plants or to produce plant-based food is significantly lower than food that comes from animals, right? We know this, and I'm pointing this out because it's publicly available scientific data, and it's going to have a relation to the Jain response. As you see, as you go above the blue line, this is all stuff that comes from animals, and the climate impact is significant, okay? The impact of daily food habits, as you see in the slide here, accounts for, and this may be on the low end, I'm not a climate scientist. I try to follow the best available public science, but there are other numbers, but the impact of daily food habits can account for maybe a quarter of greenhouse gases on the low end. It could be significantly higher when you take into account a lot of other factors, such as deforestation and all of these kinds of things. But I just want to emphasize how big our climate impact is simply through what we eat, okay? Now, why is this? Many of us may have seen this graph from Our World in Data as well, and I've blown up one particular part of it, which shows how much of our habitable land is used to grow food from animals, either meat or secretions like milk or eggs, things like this. And it's half. So you can see that 71% of our land on the earth is habitable. Half of that is used for agriculture, and almost 80%, 77% of that is used to produce meat and dairy. And just know that the meat and dairy industries, those are inseparable from one another, right? The dairy industry profits from meat, profits from leather. These things all go together as one. Okay, so the impact of that meat, we already saw the animal products, is high, right? We saw it's very high. And you can see why. I mean, 80% of the land is almost being used for meat and dairy, and only 23% is being used for crops. That land that's being used for meat and dairy is the land that's not only being used to graze animals and whatnot, it's also being used to grow food for animals, right? So when I travel anywhere in the world, whether I'm here in Switzerland or I'm in California or wherever, when I see those big open expanses of grassland, right, it hasn't always been like that. And you can think that when you look out in whatever country you're in, when you look out and you see all that empty land where food is growing, almost 80% of that is not for humans. A lot of it's deforested land that's being used to grow food for animals to feed humans, which provides a very small percentage of the global calorie supply, which you see is only 18%, right? It's so small compared to 82% of the global calories coming from plant-based food. I present all this data to you to show that when we talk about climate violence, and we want to reduce our climate violence from a Jain perspective, we want to reduce that impact, if we look at the data, it tells us where the violence is occurring. It tells us where our harm is going, depending on the way that we eat. So this is just with regard to food alone. The other thing about food is that we know, and this is related to climate change, is that drought is increasing around the world. This is known as the water footprint of certain foods, right? Or certain clothes or whatever, but I want to talk about, focus on food right now. So drought is increasing around the world, we know that. And we also know that approximately 1/3 or so of drinkable water is used for animal agriculture. 1/3 of fresh water is used for animal agriculture. And that water, the amount of water it takes to produce 1 pound of beef or 1 pound of chicken is significant. I mean, you can just look on the slide here. 1,800 gallons of water to create 1 pound of beef, almost 500 gallons of water to create 1 pound of chicken. The equivalent for soy is like fractional compared to any of this, right? For example, as a protein equivalent. The point I'm trying to make here is that animal agriculture uses a ton of our fresh water, okay, to feed animals, not humans, to water animals, if you want to put it that way, keep them hydrated, grow food for them, okay? This includes all animal agriculture, and it also pollutes our fresh water. And there are what social scientists refer to as so-called sacrifice zones all over the world, where people who are in lower socioeconomic communities and lower socioeconomic status tend to have their natural resources polluted from the runoff from animal agriculture, right? This happens all around the world. And the thing is that it causes harm to those people. They get sick, right? It's a waste of water. And so I bring this up as just to show one more form of the kind of harm that happens through the consumption of anything that comes from animals. And now let me take it to travel and work and climate change, right? This was something that surprised me the first time I did it. I drove to France over the summer for a surf trip because I'm from California. I get landlocked a lot, but I don't like to fly because of this reason, right? But I was driving across and I met a guy from Germany, Torsten, who used to work for this company, Atmosphere. And Torsten shared with me this website, Atmosphere, through which you can buy carbon offsets if you want, if you're traveling over a long distance. And what he pointed out to me was that every time if I were to fly to New York or to California, that the average impact of a flight like that was taking up twice of my climate budget, as you see here in the red in the slide, for my entire year, for my entire budget, right? My entire budget would be 1,500 kilograms, and it's over 3,000 just from one flight, all right? Now, many of us routinely fly for work. I understand that. We've noticed with the pandemic that you don't have to as much, and I'll talk about that in a moment as well. But if the impact is this high of our travel, it's causing some harm to the climate and to future generations, right? Obviously. And so it's something for us to take into account and to factor in to what is my effect on the world? What is my effect on the climate? What is the outcome of my action going to be? Okay. So, sorry, back up one second. What I've just tried to briefly show here is that there is enough empirical knowledge out there that I don't think we can deny climate change anymore. And I think a lot of people don't, but still some people do, or that it's anthropogenic. There's also a lot of data that shows us where it's happening with regards to the way that we eat, the way that we travel, the way that we work when we have to travel for work, and also the kinds of work that we do. What I want to do is jump to the third jewel of the Jain tradition, because this is where I feel this is the jewel. And for me, it was as someone in California who is already concerned about environmentalism. Okay, so in California, environmentalism is very popular, right? So I was in an already kind of friendly environment to be having these kinds of discussions, but it's like, what do you do then? Right? And it was being introduced to these Dharmic traditions in light of all of this over the last 20 years since I started studying Jain traditions and yoga traditions, that I really got inspired by the calls to action that this tradition in various ways calls us to do or shouts out to us. So this is the third jewel, correct conduct, right? And we already saw that ahimsa, nonviolence, is the highest principle in the Jain tradition. Right? It's the paramount virtue. You often hear Jains say ahimsa paramo dharmaha. Ahimsa is the highest dharma, right? We're here for the Dharma Alliance. The highest virtue, the thing we can do to sustain the world is to conduct ourselves in a way that is good for the world, And that's where correct conduct comes in the Jain tradition in light of those other things that I just mentioned to you, right? So we have the final warning now, right? Act now or it's too late. We know this, the IPCC mentioned it multiple times and just kind of closed the book on their final study last week. So what I want to do here is walk you through 3 different Jain principles that correspond to the way that we eat, the way that we travel, and the way that we work, just to give you a sense of what some of the opportunities are out there and what these opportunities suggest could lead us to, the type of experience, the type of contentment, the type of peace that these experiences could lead us to individually, but then by extension, I think collectively, because the way we treat others comes back to us, and that can go for better or for worse. And the Jain tradition is very explicit about this, and it's in the Tatpartha Sutra. It says parasparo pagraho jivanam. The function or the role of all forms of life is to serve or help one another, right? And if you read the commentary to that thing, to that sutra, it says very clearly, this can go for better or for worse, and it depends on how we conduct one another, to conduct ourselves in relation to one another, not just humans, but all forms of life, down to the smallest piece of earth, right? So it's thinking at the most sensitive level. So I'll go through these 3 things: diet, travel, and work. And what I really want to emphasize here and continue to suggest to you is that these principles are not just limitations, but really present a new opportunity, not just for Jains, for all humans to realize their highest human potential. Because Jains don't want to convert you to the Jain tradition. I can tell you that right now. I've never met a Jain who was out on the street proselytizing for people to become Jain. But what they do want you to take seriously are the principles, right? Stay where you are. If you're Christian, be Christian. If you're Muslim, stay Muslim. If you're Hindu, stay. Jains don't want you to change. They just want you to consider that these principles can lead you to an experience no matter who you are, right? All right, so here's some of the nonviolent dietary principles that emerge towards this experience of peace and contentment and ultimately freedom and omniscience in the Jain tradition. It essentially forbids eating, of course, anything from animal agriculture. When you go through Jain texts, honey is not permitted in Jain texts, okay? The sort of karmic impact, if you look back at Jain texts, of destroying a hive, for example, a beehive, is really high. It says it's the equivalent of burning 7 villages or something like that. It's like, but think about that. I mean, think about how important bees are. If you were to destroy a beehive, what do bees do for us? Well, they're so critical, as we know, in here in Switzerland, especially towards helping us grow food and stuff to eat. Number 2 is meat. So traditionally, Jains are vegetarian, and there's an increasing movement of Jains towards veganism because of the harms in dairy. And even in some cases, Jains forbid eating dairy. Not in all cases, but there's also a new movement called the Jain Vegan Initiative. This is based out of North America, but it's a global movement that has, you could say, meetup clubs through WhatsApp all over the world at this point, in all major cities around the world, founded by Sunny Jain. And they're really pushing within the Jain community for Jains to consider giving up dairy because of the manifold harms in dairy. But the climate one is the one I really want to focus on here, because you saw on the slide before, the climate impact of dairy is very high. And as a former vegetarian, I can tell you, I struggled, especially in Switzerland, when I suddenly couldn't eat raclette cheese anymore, fondue. But there's so many wonderful Swiss companies now that make New Roots, for example, that make all these wonderful alternatives. And so now I'm back to a vegan form of what I used to love, okay? So there are options, there are alternatives, but the thing is that the Jain tradition really wants us to consider the violence in eating these things, right? These are prohibitions that go back far. These are not new ideas, but I think these ideas have a lot of relevance for everything, all the data I showed you with regard to what does animal food do to the planet and to the environment. So in addition to those principles, I also want to just briefly share with you some of the nonviolent travel principles and the logic behind these. There are vows in the Jain tradition known as the Digvrata or the Desha Vakashika. And what these are basically doing is circumscribing limits around how far we travel, how we travel, where we travel, these kinds of things, because the Jain tradition is recognizing for a long time that any time you travel, you inevitably cause harm, right? Even as I walk and pace back and forth, who knows what I'm stepping on the ground, right? There's always some form of harm. When I drive my car, bugs will hit the car windshield, for example, right? When I came here on the train, surely something was killed, right? Bugs and things like this. Hopefully nothing more than that. But the point is that there's a sensitivity, a deep sensitivity here, that all travel causes harm. And today, when we look at travel, we know that this is a major cause of harm towards the climate. Planes, I've shown you, automobiles, fossil fuels, and these things are obvious forms of harm that are having an effect that we know we need to change. And what I want to point out is that the Jain tradition knows and acknowledges that we need to do this. We need to travel, but to always be focused on what's essential and what is not essential. And when you have to travel, how do you travel, right? We're blessed here in Switzerland with an amazing public transport system where I can be in Zurich and not even really have to even check anything, and then we arrive here, right? We're here in this room and we didn't have to think much about it because it's this wonderful public transport system. These kinds of things need to be considered as we develop. I talk about development, sustainable ways of transportation. I'm from Los Angeles and opposite there. So just a few more slides and then we can do some Q&A here. But the other thing I want to point out is that Ashadara, Digambara, says that the householder life will require taking life. Goal is to minimize that, right? We're not going for perfection unless we're a monk or a nun in the tradition, then we are going for perfection, right? But we are all householders, I assume, since we're all here. We can't travel from India. Even to this day, monks and nuns will not typically leave India. They will only travel by foot, giving us an example of what is possible, right? But for us householders who have families, have bills to pay and businesses and so forth, the goal is to minimize this, right? And there is a concern with how we move in this regard. And this is the final piece, which is nonviolent professional ethics. The question the Jain tradition asks here fundamentally is, do we engage in work that supports life, or do we engage in work that takes life? Do we engage in work that contributes to climate change, or do we engage in work that doesn't contribute to climate change? And as a former CPA, I used to work for KPMG and some other major consulting firms before I made the transition into doing more South Asian studies. I looked around me and I really saw how embedded some of these damaging corporate activities are in our world, right? And we need viable alternatives, right? We need to find a way to build a more sustainable world. And I know some people in this very room who are doing that right now through their entrepreneurial activity, right? So there's a vrata, a vow known as the Bhoga Upa Bhoga Vrata, which encourages life-supporting work. And there are actually 15 trades. I'm not going to go through all. I'm just going to briefly show you a list here of things that Jains have prohibited. And I think what you'll see when you see this list, right? This is a medieval list from India. You will see that the things that are forbidden in terms of work still have relevance today. Okay, number one on this list, charcoal production, right? Coal. Coal causes such significant damage, and we know we're using it to transition. We're supposed to be transitioning off of coal, but coal production remains a major issue with regard to climate change. Forest destroying activities. Forests are burned all the time to clear land for pasture in the Amazon, for example, to graze cows for beef and for dairy. Excavation, so clearing land unnecessarily. Animal trade, animal byproducts. So there you can see trade in animal agriculture, which we saw has such a big impact on the climate. Work with fire. There's the burning again of the forest, and water draining. Right? We saw how animal agriculture drains water. We saw how climate change is leading to drought. And these were things that Jains have historically prohibited. Now, I keep saying prohibited, I keep saying limits, but what I really want to emphasize is that these are not limits. I don't want us to think about them as limits. They are things that we impose on ourselves, not as limits, but as choices. And if you look at the verbal root of the word vrata, which is translated often as vow in Sanskrit, it comes from the verbal root that means to choose. I'm making a choice to do this. Why? Because I want to realize my highest human potential according to the Jain tradition. And the thing you have to know, and anybody who comes from these traditions, I think already knows, but for those who don't and are considering maybe doing some of the things I'm suggesting science is suggesting to do here, is that the experience can only be known through application and embodiment. The experience of reaching what the Jain tradition says is your highest human potential, even though we might not meet that highest human potential in this lifetime, according to the Jain tradition, you can at least get a glimpse of that. You can at least know what that feels like when you fast, for example, when you give up something that you think you need and then realize that you never really needed. The contentment that can settle in for those kinds of voluntary simplicity, that kind of voluntary, what would be called tapas or austerity, with the goal of reducing your climate footprint, the experience that emerges from that can only be known through actually doing, right? And that's a fundamental insight, I think, of not just the Jain tradition, the yoga tradition, all contemplative traditions that arise out of South Asia. So that's all I really had. I just wanted to show you briefly, I'm from Arihanta Institute, and if you want to learn more, you can get in touch with me. One of my co-founders is here, Danesh Kotari, and I really want to thank Dharma Alliance for the opportunity to present here and welcome any questions that you may have to have a conversation around this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. Thank you very much. It was informative, enlightening. As they normally say, you learn something new every day, and I can tell you myself, super informative. Thank you very much on all levels. Before we begin the Q&A this evening, just a few acknowledgements. I just want to highlight a few names. First off, Ambassador, thank you very much again for your attendance. It's wonderful to have somebody from the Genève International again come over here. Your presence is always appreciated and welcome. Also, Jaya, thank you very much again. As always, you're wonderful, and your insights, thank you again. Prashant, thank you again too. And I also want to make just a brief acknowledgement of those who have traveled beyond Geneva. Thank you very much for making the effort to come out from wherever you came from. I know it's sometimes hard and difficult, but we appreciate the effort. Now, in terms of the Q&A this evening, I want to give everyone a chance to pose any questions. So I would like to stress, be as brief and concise, and consideration for those who might want to also ask a question, because there is a time limit, of course. But whoever would like to start off.
Thank you. Thank you very much for connecting Dharma to the science. I just go back to your first or second slide, where you mentioned that Mahavir Swami and Buddha were more or less contemporary. I just wanted to go back with the right information. My impression was that Mahavir Swami was a little earlier than Buddha. Buddha did mention about Mahavir Swami, and Mahavir Swami, did he ever mention anything about Buddha? If not, then it really confirms to my knowledge that both had a little difference of couple of tens of years, although they were more or less ascend from Bombay, more or less from the more or less same area. And the second thing is, Mahavir Swami is supposed to be the 24th Tirthankar, as you mentioned. So what happened? As it is, as we know of Sikhism, the last guru he said that I am the last guru and there won't be any more gurus. Did Mahavir Swami also say similar like that, I am 24th and there is not going to be 25th or so? Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. Yeah. So to answer your first question, in terms of the dating, I'm not a historian. However, I read history from my colleagues. And I read the work of people like Johannes Bronkhorst, who's at University of Lausanne, very well-respected scholar of, I guess you could say, Jain and Dharma traditions in Greater Magadha, who writes a really compelling history, for example, of how the Jains and Buddhists, in a way, had their own kind of independent culture that was emerging or emerged in Eastern Gangetic Plain in India, right? In terms of the dating of Mahavira, the question is always, was he born in 599 or was he born in 499 and BCE? And I think so what you're speaking to, and a lot of the literature that I was immersed in when I first started doing my graduate studies, I'm trained as an ethnographer, so I tend to work in cultures with anthropologists and people, social scientists. But when I was immersed at first into this world of Jain studies, 599 was the date, which is before the Buddha, right? And then in recent years, I've been seeing other scholars who are historians trying to make the argument that it's 499. In either case, Parshvanat, who is the 23rd Tirthankara before Mahavira, he definitely was before the Buddha. And what I want to emphasize there is we don't have evidence. We only have evidence that goes so far. But the Jain tradition is a very ancient tradition in this regard, right? To answer your second question, so if let's say that Parshvanat, 23rd Tirthankara, is from the 9th century BC or so, and there's 22 more before him, how far back are we going, right? Now, according to the Jain cycle of time, this comes to your second question, it's cyclical, right? So there are 24 Tirthankaras, and they will come at a certain period in that cycle of time when it's time to restore the Jain Dharma and community, right? The teachings for people. So Mahavira was the 24th and supposedly last for now, as we're going down into this down cycle, which kind of corresponds to what's happening in global society right now, because there's a loss of Dharma, there's a loss of morality, and we find ourselves in very difficult suffering conditions, right? And so eventually it's going to swing back up, things will start getting better, and eventually they'll get so good that people will start to take it for granted, and then they'll start to mistreat each other again, and then we'll have to start to get some of these teachings again, and then the 24 will emerge in the cycle again, and it will just happen over and over and over again. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. Yeah, I think it's an important one too, because of the cycle of time. It's important to take that into consideration.
Any other further questions?
Thank you for that fascinating presentation. I have two questions. One, of course, you started off by saying your name is Jain Miller. So the story behind that, it'll be interesting to hear. Christopher, please tell us about the Jain part. And the second one, I think, is it was pretty interesting to actually link Jain traditions to SDGs. And of course, you talked about the prism of those three Ratnas in doing so, one of them being knowledge as well. And I was actually just, while you were speaking, looking at the more granular part of SDG 13, and it has 5 targets, including one which is 13.3, which is improving knowledge and understanding, etc. So I guess was wondering whether or not you can actually even go further by actually, linking Jain traditions and the teachings behind it to the more granular part of it. And I guess the conduct part of it is also perhaps related because, you talked about Jain, Mahavir being do no harm. And I guess that's also, of course, part of the idea of climate action and I guess do no harm, whether it's mitigation, that's one part of it. And then of course, adaptation. Maybe also another further thing, whether or not you can actually translate some of this more into to make this even more effective, translate some of these things in like this prism out here, for example, to some of the more technical terms that we hear in climate discussions, whether it's mitigation, adaptation, that could be somehow also perhaps even more effective in spreading the message. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you for that suggestion. And I think we can always get more granular with the knowledge. There's so much out there. And what I find powerful about this approach and the suggestion you're making is that, when these Jain texts and principles were devised, we didn't have the instruments that we have to measure this thing we're calling climate change, right? So in some ways, it's a little bit anachronistic that I'm projecting climate change back into the past, right? But I think some of the principles have a somewhat universal taste to them, and knowledge is one of them, right? Correct knowledge. What is the best knowledge you have based in the empirical world? What's the best way to get that knowledge? If you read through climate science, you read through, as you're saying, the climate SDG, you will find very granular details about what is causing climate change, And also, as you said, not just mitigation, but adaptation. What can we do to adapt so that there will be less harm to society, right? That's another question, because that's another form of harm, as you're pointing out. Those who are in less fortunate socioeconomic positions in the global south, in certain countries, even in India, where I've experienced, some people don't have access to resources, where this tradition is coming from. These are the people who are going to be most affected. And I think that when policy is developed, right, we have to question the assumptions upon which we are developing that policy, the values. And I think this adds through the conduct aspect. The conduct aspect can really inform that knowledge, because I don't know any other religious tradition or Dharma tradition, we should call it, in the world that holds such a high standard for the reduction of harm with such intricate detail, right? So in addition to the knowledge, there's also more things in the conduct, right? I didn't even mention, for example, aparigraha, which is non-possession, right? Which is shared by the Hindu tradition, which is shared by the Buddhist tradition, to reduce your possessions, right? Things like this. So there's the knowledge we know we can get from the empirical knowledge we can get from science, right? There's some in Jain text, but we can get it from science. But how we conduct ourselves and change our behavior in alignment with that science, I don't know another tradition that offers the resources that I found in the Jain tradition. Or I should say the Dharma traditions, because you can find these resources in different Dharma traditions as well, right? Not just the Jain tradition. So yeah, thank you. And by the way, this is a spoiler alert, we're my colleague Rita Sharma and I at the Graduate Theological Union, we're editing a volume that's bringing the SDGs into conversation with various Dharmic traditions. So I'm going to remember your suggestion as we develop that project about getting maybe a little more granular about where, lining these things up. The knowledge with the content will be better. So thank you for that suggestion. Oh yeah, sorry. I'll try to make this part short, but it's okay. So my birth name was Christopher Patrick Miller. Thanks for reminding me. When I was 2 years ago, when I was working with the Federation of Jain Associations in North America, Jaina, I was the first non-Indian head of a committee, and I was honored to do that. And what we did is we did a worldwide fast on Thanksgiving Day. We asked people to fast with us or have a vegan Thanksgiving so that the turkeys wouldn't be killed, right? We also sought to serve 150,000 meals, vegan meals, as you remember, right? Danesh always helps me out. We teamed up with this great global organization, Paul Rodney Turner's Food for Life, and served food not just in America, but in South Asia and Nepal to people who were in need through donations from the global Jain community. So I was on this committee. I was so immersed. I felt like it was like the peak experience of working with the Jain community on something that mattered, right? That really mattered. It was making a difference for people and influencing people's lives. And one of my Jain colleagues jokingly said, Christopher Miller is more Jain than we are. He said, change his middle name to Jain. And I laughed and I said, oh, you're funny, And deep inside, I was like, is he serious? I would be honored. And so time passed, and the president of the Federation of Jain Associations of North America invited me publicly then to change my middle name to Jain if I really meant it, right? So that was the story behind it. And when he did that, I felt a deep sense of personal responsibility because I wasn't born into the tradition, which again, doesn't try to convert people. I don't know any Jain who's tried to convert anyone, but I felt like I had already had my conversion way before I was even asked that question. I thought, this is something that I believe in wholeheartedly, not as a religion, but as a way of life. And so when the president, Mahesh Vadher of Jaina, the former president of Jaina, invited me formally to do that without hesitation and with a lot of self-doubt, I said, okay. So since then, with the permission of Jaina and my friends there, I've been publishing under that name as well. So you'll see my work. Before it was Christopher Patrick Miller, and now it comes out as Christopher Jain. Always enjoyed telling you. Thanks for asking.
Okay. Hey, Christopher, brilliant talk. Thank you so much. My question is more of a devil's advocate here.
Absolutely.
In one of the slides, we saw that how skewed up is the ratio of the animal-based industry to farming. Again, like I said, a devil's advocate, if this was to turn around the way Jain principles are, if let's say the whole world is to convert into being a vegan or a vegetarian, what happens with the load on the farming that that this brings to the world? Because farming industry is also known to exploit soil, earth. For instance, something like growing soy is very, very dangerous to the soil, and it's been documented all over the world. So let's say if everybody turns into a vegan, what happens to the ecological balance? What happens to the earth? Is that not violence also?
It's a good question. So I'll reiterate, I think the goal here isn't, we're not going to eliminate the violence, but we can reduce it significantly, right? I always tell my vegan friends too, and we know this in the vegan world, that veganism isn't perfection. It's not perfection. Even some of the vegan food we eat, like we eat coconuts from certain regions, we know that monkeys have been used to harvest those coconuts, right? And those animals have suffered, and that's on us, you know, if we know that. We know, for example, women's hands especially are destroyed from peeling cashews, and cashews provide the basis. They're a great climate change crop, but they destroy women's hands who make almost nothing to peel them, right? So just to bring that all together, I think, again, the goal is to reduce harm as much as possible. And even within the vegan lifestyle, to look for further opportunities, look for other crops, look for crops that aren't so destructive, right? But the big thing, the big piece of information that I get from this slide is the amount, the sheer amount of land that's being used for meat and dairy versus just food for plants and trees. And that's the part that I think is a huge initial step and opportunity. And I think it's why Dr. Peter Carter from the IPCC said that in order to avert the worst of climate change and what's coming, there's an ethical imperative, and I'm paraphrasing what he said, there's an ethical imperative for the entire world to be veganized. He's not saying that from some like high moral ground. He's saying it from a very inductive scientific method of look, we've identified where the harm's coming from, and this is how we can do it. So it won't be perfect, but it will be significantly. We know we cannot avert the worst if we don't do that. I mean, the IPCC has said that multiple times. I know. I appreciate your question, because these kinds of questions come up all the time from people who are not convinced, right? So it's important to ask. Thank you for asking. Yeah. Yes, please. Oh, yeah, sorry.
Hello. Yes.
Yes.
Thanks very much for a very lucid presentation. My main problem is there are so many actors in this world. And based on the principles that you have enumerated, how long will it take to bring about the changes? How many generations? And how can we do that?
Very good question. Did you have a related question?
That's okay, just supplementary.
So, yeah.
Thank you, Chris. Just supplementary to what he said, so that you can club the answer together. Essentially, the way I look at it is that, you know, the agriculture pattern is a consequence of what is happening on the food side of the equation. And I think we have to accept the fact, or at least I have noticed during last couple of decades, especially when I was out of India, food has basically become kind of a religion in majority of the places. So, you know, people swear by the kind of food they eat as if, you know, they are swearing by a particular religion. Now, what I'm trying to say is that essentially, don't you think that it is a war of narrative at the end of the day? There are benefits, of course, on the vegetarian vegan side. I'm, by the way, myself vegetarian, but the point is that there are narrative on both sides of the equation. But I think we have to also accept the fact that the industry on the top end of the bottom, top end of the column has actually done a very good job in terms of marketing the narrative of food in a particular way. So I think there could be a merit in terms of what vegan or a vegetarian way in terms of sustainability to the planet is,
But if we don't come up with a narrative which is appealing to the average person who is walking around the street, I think it, to a large extent, it's going to be a pipe dream for people to actually convert to that reality. Earth might get destroyed and ripped apart because of that habit, but they don't care. That will come in the end. It's essentially, at the end of the day, it's narrative, whether that's an appealing narrative or not. So your thought about that?
Yeah, I think about this a lot, actually. Both of these questions of like, well, I think to start, we know we only have a very short window of time, right? So we have to do everything we can as fast as we can. And I think the IPC has said that, right? How do we do it? Every day, through every interaction, through everything that we work on and we do. I remember Bill McKibben came to our big religious studies conference like 10 years ago or so, a little less than a decade ago. And he said, I want you all to know now, to the religious studies scholars, I want you all to know now, all religious traditions, there were like 4,000 of them or so. He said, you need to devote at least 20% of the work in your classrooms to climate change. Because it's going to be the biggest thing that we need to address in the coming decades, right? And so I took that as like a call to action, that we have to do everything we can at every moment, every opportunity we have, every interaction we have. And the thing that we're running into, to transfer into your question, that I think slows this process down, are the disinformation campaigns that are everywhere and are ubiquitous and that deny climate science and give people these narratives to demonize people who are simply having the correct worldview based on the correct knowledge and trying to align their conduct with that knowledge, right? A great example of this is that in the IPCC's final report last week, there was a suggestion before it was finalized that the plant-based diet was the way forward, right? For example, it was a critical piece forward, but because of various corporate lobbying interests, that was removed from the final report. And so you have corporate interventions, I'm going to say it in a nice way, right? That are smothering correct knowledge, that are perpetuating an incorrect worldview of delusion that is totally out of alignment with these Dharmic principles and will only exacerbate over the long term, maybe over the next 50 years, right? A very serious problem. And it's difficult. It's difficult. It's also difficult if you're one of the people who's having difficult conversations to constantly be, even for my friends, this isn't, I'm not out on the street promoting veganism or like that, right? Like I have to embody it if I'm going to tell people in my presentations. I'm not out there. I'm not an activist on the street. I'm an educator. I follow the best peer-reviewed information I could find. That's the correct knowledge. And then I present what seems to be a reasonable response to that information, right? And I try to do that in the smallest of circles that I'm in, right? I do it with my students. A lot of my students become vegan, and I love when that happens, right? But even, I'll tell you, even within the Jain community, sometimes I get friction when I talk about veganism. Jains push back against me and say, why are you going to give up dairy? And they get actually really angry sometimes. They send me really hateful messages. And I'm like, look, I'm not doing it because I don't like how it tastes. Because believe me, like I told you, cheese is hard to give up, right? But I'm doing it because this is what science and a reasonable person would do, right? Or what science is telling me to do. So it's at this micro level. The forces that we're up against, it seems almost impossible. The discourses the disinformation that we're up against. I get it in my mail. I got something in my mailbox yesterday. I don't want to call any organization out, but I got something in my mailbox here yesterday. That was such a disinformation campaign against the effects of animal agriculture in Switzerland that I was dismayed when I received that in the mail. Some of you may have received that same thing in Zurich yesterday. I was dismayed. And I was, but it also like recommitted me when I knew I was going to come give this talk today. And I thought this kind of invigorates me even more to want to have the conversation. And I think that we have to all keep trying, doing our best with the little minimal tools that we have, the platforms like Dharma Alliance and things like this, to just say, this is what science is saying, please adjust your behavior, right? And also from the Jain perspective, if we want to look at it from a very big perspective, from the Jain perspective, if we want to be fully honest, the Jain perspective also, as the Dharmic perspectives say, that we are in a morally declining state of society, right? The Kali Yuga or the Dushma age, whatever you want to call it. And this is actually part of the normal state of affairs. Things are just going to fall apart before they get any better. Now, I don't believe that. I don't want to believe that. But I just want to say that you know, sometimes when you scope out like that, it makes you realize like what little control you have. But from a Dharmic perspective, this is what I love about people who really approach Dharma in a detached way. You do and you say what's right and what's true without being attached to the outcome, right? That's very much Bhagavad Gita as well. We all have to do it in our own way. I'm not perfect. I do things that I shouldn't do, right? I took a car ride to the train station today, right? Even though we do things all the time. We're always all causing harm, but we have to be the best example we can for our students, for each other, to try to embody these principles to show others what's possible, right?
Thank you very much for a stimulating lecture and talk. And I really like the way how you connected everything to that one word, ahimsa, you know, nonviolence, and can be applied in various situations and contexts. I had a question about, because we said that the correct knowledge is empirical knowledge. I think empirical means scientifically evidence-based knowledge. So I was wondering, because we say that the action, the correct conduct that we are advocating, are there studies that one could do or the Jain community has done in terms of showing how a change of lifestyle and look at its impact in terms of carbon emissions or in terms of something else, to say that if you change, because we said the narrative is also very important. Of course, you cannot just give data, but then we can do the narrative can be revolved around some evidence-based data. And so you can say that if lifestyles are like people give up meat, or if lifestyles are changed in this way, here is what quantitatively or measurably, how you can save our planet, how you can, reduce your carbon emissions and things like that. So have there been studies, or is there any, thought about, what's your thought about doing such studies to show it to the community?
Yeah, I think it's fantastic. And I think there's a couple different examples I'll give, right? So I try to just do a taste of what that would be here, right? Just a taste. I just remembered, thank you for reminding me, I have a free online course that I've produced through Arihanta Institute at arihanta-academy.com. That course I produced in collaboration, or we produced in collaboration with Museum Breitberg in Zurich, which is having a Jain exhibition right now, by the way, that you should all go see. It's a wonderful exhibition. And in that course, short free course on Jain responses to climate change, I do a little bit more of the granularity that we're talking about. I always start with the data, the knowledge first, and then go to the Jain response, right? So data first, Jain response next. And so it takes a lot of what I said here and puts it out in a lot more detail. It's free, so if anybody wants to enroll in that, you're welcome to do that. And I think that this is the way to approach it, right? The only way we can know the harm that we're causing is with the best peer-reviewed evidence that we have. And I'm not a climate scientist, but I have to trust that the international scientific peer-reviewed empirical system, it's not perfect, it's not free of power relation, but overall, what else am I going to rely on? Like this, I don't know of anything else, right? So I think more studies need to be done. And I think this is what my colleague Rita Sharma and I at the GT are trying to do in this new volume that we're bringing out, is like really showing the issue and put it into a conversation with the solution from various Dharmic perspectives. Yeah, I think it's great. The other example I can give is just because I have so many conversations with Danesh Kotari, my co-founder who's here, is Pi to Life, right? And we can approach, for example, food in a way where we do have the measurement. So you walk into like Cope or the Migros, I can't remember who has that, it's EMLA or VILA, and you have the climate stars on your, in addition to the health rating on your food, you have the climate stars. How it's the climate impact. Even though some of those I still don't, how do you, I don't trust because I don't know where they're coming from, right? If I knew it was coming from some kind of peer-reviewed scientific basis, then I would probably be like more on board with it, because sometimes I'm surprised. But to be able to show in every little thing we do, such as you do through Pi to Life, to show the consumer that this is what the impact of your choice is going to have from a scientific kind of data-backed way, at least to some degree, would be a powerful way to get people to change their consumer choices, which matter significantly, right? So if I knew that I was going to buy a hamburger or an Impossible Burger made from soy, and I saw clearly from a scientific perspective that the hamburger has 1,800 gallons of water in it, and the soy one has like, I don't know, 200 gallons. I don't know what the number is. Right? It's really low. And there's an app or a platform that's going to show me that. Then as someone who's committed to Jain principles, I would find that as a very great, what I like to call opportunity to reduce the himsa. So there's measurable ways to see in everyday life, right in front of me or on an app or something. I know. Yeah, great question. Thanks. Satish, yes, please.
Short, specific question on Jain Dharma in practice today. Do Jains believe in incarnation, birth and rebirth as number one? And number two, do Jains do conversion? If a Jain man is going to marry a non-Jain, let's say a Hindu girl or the other way, is, so to say, official conversion a practice or not?
No, but good questions. I think these are important questions for everyone to know, right? So to answer your first question, yes, the Jain tradition believes in reincarnation, and that reincarnation is based on your karma, and that karma is based on the harm or lack of harm that you caused throughout your life and previous lives, right?
So probably you were born Jain in last birth or going to be next birth.
I hope so. Yeah, I always say I hope to be born as a Jain. And I think all Jains hope to be born in a position eventually where they'll have the opportunity to renounce, become a monk or nun, to really set the highest bar for what it means to embody nonviolence in India, right? As far as conversion goes, yeah, once again, like I've never met a Jain who wanted to convert me or anyone else. I've only met Jains, and they don't have a specific conversion process, so to speak. I've only met Jains who do a variety of things. One is they'll see someone, they'll see like an animal advocate, vegan or somebody like that, and they'll say, that person's a Jain. Even though they're not a Jain, they could be a Christian, they could be an atheist, whatever. They just see themselves a reflection of their tradition in the way that this person is living, right? So for example, at Arihanta Institute, we bring in animal advocates to teach courses about the benefits of veganism, for example, on all levels, right? Jains see themselves in these other tradition activities, right? But they would never want to convert anyone, I don't think. Yeah, it's a good question. But they really appreciate, they see environmentalists and they get excited, right? Would you say that's true? You're Jain.
Can you hear me? I just want very quickly add one more point to what you and sir, you mentioned. You need to look at this entire transition towards less harmful products and veganism particularly, draw parallels with what happened with tobacco industry. Just a few decades ago, there was a very heavy promotion narratives about even doctors and medical professionals saying, oh, cigarette smoking is good for you. But just in last couple of decades, or probably 15, 20 years ago, when it started to turn out that actually it was misinformed, a large set of communities backed by whatever lobbyist money, pharma companies and whatnot. But still the decline has not been that heavy. People still make those choices. So it's not about how many generations, it's about how, it could be even in 10 years that people could actually reduce dramatically, or it could not happen even for next 1,000 years. It's in our hands to make those choices, right? Despite this real clear empirical knowledge. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Things that we heard today, these are not going to be implemented by the actors because we are all animals of habit. We have had decades of habits, and it is impossible to change. And even if the change comes, it is so slow that you will not be able to reverse the processes which are already functioning. The only way is if you have a set of values which can be imparted to the younger generations, then you have the hope. That means your whole education system has to be revamped, redesigned, and then brought to those people who can really accept, adopt, and practice it. Therefore, that is why I asked, my question was, how many generations will it take? Because I don't think many of you will not be able to see that many changes. But if you agree with the set of values which can be imparted to the future generations, there is a hope ahead, but not in the near future.
I also think that there is some hope. And the reason I say that is because you're talking about smoking. In the United States, I grew up in the United States. The tobacco industry did everything that Danesh just said. Smoking was everywhere. My family members smoked. Smoke was everywhere. They led a truth campaign. This online, it wasn't even online, it was on TV and in print because it was like before the internet was a big thing, right? It was called Truth. And this campaign just simply showed the public through this campaign, this ongoing campaign for several years, I think, how bad smoking is for you. And in America, the number of smokers and everything dramatically dropped to the point where now it's a taboo. And I think that we can do the same thing with all of these things, not just animal agriculture, but we have to, truth with a capital T, the correct knowledge, we have to make it public. We have to make the public aware of it. And we did see in a very short period of time with that truth campaign that the smoking and the harmful health effects, I should say, of smoking went away. Family members of mine quit smoking because of this truth campaign, right? And with climate change, okay, so that's more of a individual choice for someone's health. But because climate change affects all of us, and it's going to affect those younger generations, what science is saying is we can't wait. We have to do it now, even if we're in the older generations, right? And the younger generations get frustrated hearing that the older generations can't change because the older generations are the ones that created the problem in the first place, right? So the people younger than me, right? I'm in my 40s. People younger than me are going to have to deal with the worst, and probably me myself too. But what they're asking us to do, they don't need the education. They know, they feel helpless, right? A lot of them are helpless. They're out on the street getting arrested simply for raising their voice with this correct knowledge, right? They're getting put in jail. They're being hated for it. They already know. They know. They have the values. They're asking us, our generation. They're saying, change the way you live, change your policies, vote differently, act differently. And the IPC said it the other day, do it at every level of society. So that means you. That means you. It means every single one of us in here has to do it, right? And I'm also here to say that as someone who grew up in America, eating McDonald's, Jack in the Box, Wendy's, I don't know if you know any of these places, Burger King is here. I ate this, I swear, I ate this almost every Taco Bell, every single day. I worked at Pizza Hut, I ate tacos. And when I'm saying this is all full of meat, and I regret these years, right? But when I was exposed to this system in Dharmic tradition and Dharmic values, light bulb went off. And that's why I think the science is important because it gives us the data. It tells us what we need to do. But we know that it reaches its limits in terms of inspiring people to actually make a change. And that's why I think that the Dharmic message can inspire people. Not just what I've shown you here, the beautiful stories in Dharma traditions of people like Mahavira, who I showed you. There's so many other stories from the Jain tradition of advocacy and acknowledging that you are a human being who feels compassion, right? It's a beautiful thing. You're not going to find that all the time in these scientific studies on our world and data. You're going to get good data, but you're not going to get necessarily so inspired, right? So I think we need to bring these worlds together. And also at the level of policy making and other levels to have a different conversation that gets people to actually change.
The narrative that we're discussing here, and if I look at it from a layman's perspective, if you go out and talk about Jainism or Dharma, most thing that people know about is their approach towards how they want the world to be more vegetarian. And that's also primarily the discussion that we are having here. From what you showed, statistically, empirical data, it shows that travel and a lot of other things are 10 times more dangerous to the environment. Also here today, for the first time, although having some knowledge about Dharma, but this is today that I realized that travel is something that is, if not forbidden, but the Dharma principles say that one should be cognizant of how much or does he really need to travel. So there are so many things apart from the food habits which have more percentage impact on the climate as well. Do you think organizations like Dharma Alliance and a lot of Jain activities should focus more on these things also? Because if, let's say, the whole world turns around into vegetarian, that's also still 5% tops impact on the climate change. But then there are a lot more pressing issues that people like you should be talking about. It's just a thought.
Yeah, there's more. So for example, if you take the course on Jain responses to climate change, I talk about consumption, I talk about waste, I talk about a lot of these other issues, right? And I think, again, the call of the IPCC is everybody, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, we need to change all of this, right? So I can only do so much. Thank you for coming. I can only do so much myself. You can only do so much yourself. But it's asking us to do what we can for all different issues at every level, right? So also educate yourself. Be able to recognize a disinformation campaign. They're very, very cunning, these disinformation campaigns, just as it was with the tobacco lobby when I was a kid, right? There was a time when I was a teenager where I thought it was cool to smoke cigarettes until the Truth campaign came out. I was like, okay, no more, right? And then soon thereafter, no more Wendy's and no more Burger King. But I really think we have to just keep doing what we can at the individual level that we can, and also advocate for the structural change as well, both. Thank you.
We have time for one brief question.
Thank you so much for excellent presentation. Obviously you're so passionate. So my little question was about what prompted you? I mean, why did you choose that path in your life? So that's one part of the question. But another one, which maybe because I'm working on toxic waste, and 11 million of plastics is thrown in the sea every year. So by 2025, there will be more plastics in the sea than fishes. So, and you touched a little bit about possession, right? That we should not. So, I mean, just next time when you do this, it would be great if you could also maybe focus on consumption, and that we are such a society that consume and consume and consume, and we are brainwashed by the corporates who want to sell everything to us, even food, that we're eating 5 times a day. We don't need to eat. In the jungle, we were eating maybe once a day. So, so it's a lot. So yeah, that one part, it will be fantastic if you take it up next time, but yeah.
No, I'm really happy you mentioned it. Again, this is another topic that's it's in this other course I did on consumption and waste. It's a thing in there, and this principle of non-possession and reducing that is an important part of this overall puzzle. I can only do so much in like 30, 35 minutes. So if we want to do a round 2, we can talk. Another part of my research, actually, I also research in yoga studies. I'm about to publish a book called Embodying Transnational Yoga. One of those chapters really dives into the field of pollution studies, and it looks at pollution in India in relation to yoga and things like this. So I have a really deep interest in the way that the things you're describing are so important, because there's waste and plastic, and all these things contribute so much to the overall equation. I read one statistic when I was creating the course that if waste in all of its forms were a country, it would be the 3rd largest emitter, right, of climate change emissions. This thing is from the University of California. It's shocking to hear that, right? Waste with food, plastic, and it's shocking to hear. Also about plastic, I don't know if you can corroborate this, but I think plastic alone, the plastic production process, has the equivalent of emissions of Africa or something like that. I read that in a public forum, right? It's just so much. And only that, it's just so disgusting because it's everywhere. It's killing wildlife, it's killing biodiversity. So yeah, I'm with you. Thank you. And I'm so passionate about it because I'm a surfer, and the first major encounter and transformative experience I had was when I was surfing after a storm in Southern California, surrounded by plastic that had washed down the river. And I had like I call it a mystical experience, but it was like a shocking, overwhelming experience in the water where I knew that something had gone wrong. This is 20 years ago, the same time I'm taking this Indic traditions course. And then this concern comes together, and here we are. So anyways, thank you. Yeah.
Christopher, thank you very much. Thank you very much to everyone here. Before we sign off, I know that briefly, just a couple of things that we need to just highlight. If you haven't signed, please, for those of you who have joined us for the very first time, just jot your name down, email address. We'd really appreciate to maintain contact with you so that way we can share information with you. If you, for some reason, didn't get our email, WhatsApp, whatever, recheck your filters because these things do happen and we want to avoid any confusion and mistakes and for future communication. Next point regarding our next conference, we don't have a specific date yet, but keep in mind that in early May, there will be another conference. You will get the details soon enough. No names yet, just keep that in mind. And lastly, I just want to thank our technician, Amor Sabakar. Fantastic job. Fantastic. All right. So for all of you who's online watching us, thank you also for joining us. Until next time. Bye.